What I've always loved most about the Final Fantasy series is how different each game is from the others. In world, characters, story, but also the unique emotions each game tries to evoke out of the player. So when I hear or see people constantly argue about what the best Final Fantasy game is, or when I hear the term doesn't feel like Final Fantasy, I feel a little confused. I honestly believe that Final Fantasy is meant to be subjective, that each game isn't trying to outdo the others, but rather to challenge itself and connect with different kinds of people each time. I believe that Hironobu Sakaguchi, the series creator, also felt this way when having to begin development on the sequel to the hit game that saved his career in the video game industry and the company of Square as a whole. Ever since I started my career path in market research and data analytics, one of the greatest lessons I've learned is that the most meaningful information you can gather is not on the surface, but rather what you have to work for and spend a lot of time analyzing and comparing with other data. On the surface, Final Fantasy II has been labeled the black sheep of the franchise, and even just a bad game in general. I want to step past this way of thinking and see what Final Fantasy II has to offer when given true time, thought, and most importantly, imagination. Final Fantasy II follows the story of four youth running for their lives after the evil empire of Palamecia takes over and burns their hometown, killing their parents in the process. Firion, the lead protagonist, Guy, the unintended comic relief of the group, Maria, Firion's subtle love interest, and Leon, Maria's brother and Firion's best friend, while trying to escape, are attacked by some of the Empire's toughest knights and are left for dead, except Leon, who is captured. In this story, it is actually the princess who rescues you, rather than the typical plot device from the 80s in which the hero rescues the princess. When Firion comes to and reunites with Maria and Guy, the three survivors ask Princess Hilda if they can join Wild Rose and help fight against the Empire. Hilda, seeing these kids as bringing no utility to the faction, refuses their request to join Wild Rose. This is where the keyword system is introduced, which at the time, and still today in my opinion, is quite innovative and adds a deeper level of interaction with non-playable characters. You then quickly realize that Final Fantasy II is a story about overcoming adversity and proving yourself in a darkness-ridden world. When the young heroes step out into the world map, the music accurately reflects the feelings the characters must have at the time: tragedy, despair, and loss. I would also add in hope, because even though they were denied the opportunity to join Wild Rose, they still chose to suck it up and fight anyway. And remember, these kids just lost their parents and their homes. I can only imagine what these traumatizing events have done to the minds of these characters. This is where Final Fantasy II stands out. A lot of the time, the heroes in the series are likely heroes. In the original game, there is a prophecy about 4 warriors of light that will come to restore light to the crystals and the world. So when Princess Sarah of Cornelia is captured by a fallen knight named Garland, all of a sudden these warriors appear and immediately rescue her with no problems at all, then go on to save the rest of the world. Even the world map music screams motivation and adventure. Final Fantasy II's doesn't quite feel that way, but is as equally effective. Instead of saving the princess and returning her to her kingdom, your first quest entails having to watch a man die from his wounds after confessing his undying love for a woman that he will never see again. Adventure doesn't have to be filled with light and ease of success. And Final Fantasy II has taught me that adventure can mean many things, often realistically filled with despair and loss for some people. With all that in mind, I am still surprised to this day how underappreciated the villain is in Final Fantasy II. The Emperor has arguably had more of an effect on the world's morale than any other in the series. Instead of focusing on the world as a whole, you get to see firsthand the personal effects a villain can have on the lives of individuals and families. Before talking more about the story, let's dive into the character progression system. This is where the very strong flavor of Final Fantasy II turns off most people.
Compared to traditional levels being gained, in this game, your abilities, weapons, and stats level up as they are specifically used. This can be an arduous process to strengthen your party, especially for completionists who love to max out everything. I personally just focus on a few spells and one weapon type for each character in each playthrough. It keeps it simple, but also adds for more replay value to switch things up in later playthroughs. A wonderful aspect in the remakes about the magic system is the spell animation becomes more elaborate and detailed as its level increases. Check out level 16 Flare compared to level 1 Flare. This alone motivated me to grind spells more. Because of this, Final Fantasy II has my favorite spell animations in the entire series. I do have to say that without knowing any of the exploits or tricks, the NES version is one of the hardest RPGs I've ever beaten. Some of the battles are just insanely unfair, and it can happen way too often because of the taxing encounter rate. It's a brutal experience, but it ironically fits the narrative and theme that I talked about earlier. There are many tricks to break up the difficulty, however. In the NES and Origins versions, you can do the command cancel trick, which acts as if you had used that ability and in turn makes the grinding a much quicker process. Instead of mindlessly attacking yourself to test your HP stat, it is more efficient to make use of the swap spell, which switches your HP and MP with the enemy. I've often heard from people that Final Fantasy II is way too exploitable and too easy. That can be true, but most people are not going to know about these tricks, especially on the first playthrough. I didn't know about them until I had already beaten the game a few times. Since I have learned about these methods, I like the game even more now, to be honest. But I would only use these after I had already finished the game. If this does bother you, then I would recommend not looking up information like this and spoiling the experience. Every game in the series has an early exploit to break the difficulty, but sadly FF2 and FF8 received the most flack for it. I personally love the progression system in FF2. I used to just look at it negatively from the surface, but there's so much you can do with it that makes each playthrough fresh and exciting. I would also note that the exploits help me focus on the brilliant aspects rather than being on the edge of my seat clawing to survive. It's widely known that Cid and the Chocobos made their legendary debuts in this installment. Looking back to Final Fantasy II, its Bestiary has brought more to the legacy of the series than perhaps any other game. Many of the most popular monsters in the franchise first appeared in this entry: Marlboro, Coral, Antlion, Bomb, Adamantoise, the mysterious rare encounter of the Iron Giant, which is my favorite FF creature, and the epic in-game introduction of the Behemoth. I mean, you cannot ask for a grander entrance. I think what I love most about the monster design is that I'm visually reminded of cartoons I enjoyed watching as a kid: He-Man, Thundercats, and Scooby-Doo. There aren't many side quests in the game, especially in the original version, but they are still worth doing. For example, returning to Deist after obtaining the airship allows you to conclude the story of the Dragoons. Before leaving their kingdom behind, the last remaining family decides to give the heroes the most treasured possession of the Dragoons, which is the famous Excalibur sword. This event is vital in several ways, and I'll touch more on its significance later. The remakes added a concentration minigame which can be played on the Snowcraft. It is exactly the same as the matching game in Super Mario Bros. 3 and offers many rewards that are well worth your time. I love it. It adds a nice lighthearted distraction to an emotionally dense story, and I think it's one of the most fun and rewarding minigames in the series. The less you miss a match, the better your rewards will be. This is a great way to earn quick gil and items early on. For getting no errors will reward you with tons of gil and an elixir. If you want to take this domination even further, have one of your characters grind the Toad spell up to level 16, then play again. The character slots will change to frog equivalents, and the rewards become godly. You can get a full set of Genji equipment, an Aegis shield, and a ribbon or Masamune, depending on which version of the game you play. This is one of the many reasons it is worth playing each version of Final Fantasy II. The Arcane Labyrinth is an additional set of dungeons that is exclusive to the PSP version. It allows you to play through various puzzles depending on the keywords you input into a warp zone,
The stages are usually based on areas in the main game and eventually lead to super bosses and exclusive powerful weapons only in this version. My favorite puzzle is the Mask stage, where a doppelganger mirrors your every move and you have to guide it to step on a switch to be able to finish. The new super bosses, Frekios and Doomian, are newly designed and aren't lazy palette swaps of other bosses. Frekios. I want to name a kid after that. For those who are interested in the lore of Final Fantasy II, the story of Doomian and the Arcane Labyrinth side quest brings to light the origins of the world's civilization and magic, and why some magic had to be sealed away because of the people fearing those with no conscience having access to such power. Soul of Rebirth is a separate game you can unlock after completing the main story in either the GBA or PSP versions. It is an alternate reality of what is going on in FF2's equivalent of Heaven, and stars the characters that died in the main game story, including Gordon's brother Scott. It is probably my favorite addition to any of the remasters or remakes in the Final Fantasy universe, and I strongly recommend playing it. I love it so much that I'll probably do a separate video on it in the future, so I won't dive into it much right now. Overall, I love the side content. It enhances the narrative and can be a relieving distraction that most enjoy in later Final Fantasy games. Play the original version for the greatest challenge and experience how impressive this game had to have been in 1988. Play FF Origins for a more balanced version that is the most faithful to the original. Play the GBA and WonderSwan version for an easier experience and for Soul of Rebirth, and the PSP version for beautiful animations of the lighting and weather, along with access to the Arcane Labyrinth and Soul of Rebirth. It's hard to say which one I prefer, I just love them all. The soundtrack of Final Fantasy II is one of the most powerful in the series, especially for being an NES game. While preparing for the review over the past few months, I've listened to the soundtrack countless times to try to feel the intended emotions of the game, and I have not gotten sick of it yet. The Rebel Army is probably the most popular song from the game, and rightfully so. Its placement in the story is perfect. When many of the other tracks represent tragedy, the Rebel Army is the singular symbol of hope within a disheartened world. I can't think of a song that metaphorically stands out in the series as much as this does for its respective narrative. It's also worth noting that this game does not have an airship theme. It almost did, but Nobuo Uematsu removed it so that the somber feeling of the game would remain. After proving yourself useful to Princess Hilda and joining Wild Rose, I feel like almost every dungeon and location after is quite memorable. The Tower of the Magi is one of the coolest ideas, with each set of floors representing a different element and thus fighting a boss respective to each. The unique story events make the world feel so inspired. Saving the last wyvern egg while fighting off a group of chimera, flying on that same wyvern into the cyclone, a tropical island with a creepy mask-wearing tribe, the Lamia Queen trying to seduce Firion, a dungeon inside of Leviathan's stomach, a Star Wars-inspired battle station. Actually, the general plot of this game is obviously inspired by Star Wars, and also Guy can speak to beavers. There are so many cool story elements that I never noticed until recently. One of them, again going back to directly comparing to Final Fantasy I. When the four Warriors of Light set out on their journey in that game, they look back at the city they just saved, kind of foreshadowing what they will do for the rest of the world. In the initial cutscene of the remake of FF2, you see that the four heroes look back at their burning hometown they failed to save, thinking of the innocent people that lost their lives, including their parents. This also is foreshadowing in a way. In Final Fantasy II, you have many allies within Wild Rose that join your side to help you succeed. Most of them, sadly, don't survive. Scott risked his life to save Princess Hilda, Minwu exerts all of his power to lead you to the Ultima Scroll, Ricard fights the resurrected Emperor to allow you to escape on the Wyvern, and Joseph uses his own body to keep a boulder from crushing the party. It's weird that the NES version is the only one that gave more time for the party to mourn over Joseph's death. The remakes actually quickly cut from the sad music playing when he dies, while the original keeps it playing until you exit the cave. Maybe because in the remakes, his face is really messed up. It's like this is post-crushed by a boulder Joseph. Leon is my favorite character in the game, and one of my favorites in the series. He's ultimately revealed to be the Dark Knight in the story and start of the anti-hero dynamic. If you look at other characters like this, there's usually a happy ending for that character. Cecil knew his actions were wrong and he corrected them, ultimately finding redemption. Cain was just under a possession spell the whole time and came to his senses later. After it's revealed that Leon is the Dark Knight, he stays that way almost for its entirety. Even after the party technically kills the Emperor, Leon chooses to become the new Emperor for the sake of power. The old Emperor obviously doesn't let this slide. After being killed, he goes to Hell, overthrows Satan and his minions, and ultimately takes it over to bring the Castle of Hell Pandemonium into the world. This is awesome. This is a unique moment for Leon and the rest of the party. Leon has done a lot of damage and is the reason for many deaths that took place. It's obvious he feels a lot of guilt for this and wants to recompense for his crimes. He then commits himself to helping his friends destroy the Emperor for good. By the way, I have to talk about this. In Final Fantasy IV, the King of Fabul gives Cecil a blade that once belonged to a powerful Dark Knight. I strongly believe that either this sword belonged to Leon, or the King of Fabul is Leon himself.
Leon has the exact same hair color, and he even warns Cecil about the dangers of being a Dark Knight.
The Dragoon child of Deist is literally Cain. Well, first of all, his name is Cain, and he goes on about how he wants to be a great Dragoon like his father. Cain's biological father's name is Philip,
but Ricard adopts him.
In the DS remake of Final Fantasy IV, it is stated that Cain's father's name was Ricard and died fighting against an empire. Ricard tells Cain directly that he will watch after him and train him to become a powerful Dragoon. So what does this have to do with Leon? Hear me out. After returning to Deist before facing the Emperor for the last time, Cain and his mother give you the Excalibur and say that they must leave for good. Around the same time, Leon can't forgive himself for his misdeeds and leaves for good also. I think that Leon caught up to Cain and Elena and left with them to another world. How? Well, Final Fantasy IV has a ship that travels through space, so I believe the three of them traveled to the world of Final Fantasy IV to escape the awful memories of their previous world, Leon's sins, and the Dragoons having been wiped out. Mysidia is a town in both games as well, so connections definitely exist. There are tons of references and Easter eggs scattered throughout the series, but I feel like the Cain, Ricard, Leon stuff is pretty specific, and it would make sense from a narrative and lore standpoint. I could be completely wrong with all of this, but it's fun to try to connect all those dots. So now begins the moment every Final Fantasy fan loves, preparing to enter the final dungeon. If you're going to defeat the Lord Master of Hell, you must go through Hell itself. Final dungeons are very important to me, and this game has one of the best. After traveling through the Jade Passage from Mysidia, you enter Castle Pandemonium. The theme song is stellar, and the visuals are pink. Never thought Hell would be pink, but I like it. The NES trilogy knew how to do good final dungeons. Tough monsters, epic boss battles guarding the best equipment in the game, and on the edge of your seat attentiveness. This is a finale done right. How cool is it the Emperor's minions are goetic demons, and a zombie version of Borgin, who the party defeated earlier in the story. Hidden inside one of the castle's walls is the most powerful blade in the game, the Masamune. This is another case of the NES version making an event a much bigger deal and provides a fanfare for you to enjoy. After tearing through Zombie Borgin, Tiamat, Beelzebub, and Astaroth, and getting all the best gear, you then make your way to the highest floor to enter the final battle with the Emperor of Hell. I'd strongly encourage trying to encounter the rare Iron Giant before you do that though. This is my favorite design of the enemy along with Final Fantasy V, and it actually can drop additional Genji equipment, and an extra Excalibur sword if you want one. This is the moment of anxiety that comes right before a final boss. You double check all your equipment, you make sure every ounce of HP and MP is filled to its capacity, take a deep breath, and so it begins. Each version of the game has a different design for the final boss fight, except GBA and Wonderswan, which are identical. I'd have to say my favorite is Origin's Catfish Emperor. He may hit hard, or even cast that dreaded Starfall spell, but just slap on the blood sword, berserk your characters, and the world has been saved by the Warriors of Light. I find it ironic that the rebel army and Princess Hilda focus more of their efforts on things that didn't amount to much. Mithril, Dragoons, and Ultima. What made the biggest difference, though, was what they originally didn't believe in. Out of the wild, chaotic, unforgiving brush emerges a beautiful, untamable flower that is hard to pluck by force. Wild Rose is the perfect symbol of the much-needed light in this world. The long war ended at last. The Emperor and Pandemonium and the monsters plaguing every corner of the world, they all vanished. Peace has finally returned. The people will slowly heal the scars of war. The memory of those dismal days will fade with time, but one memory will remain clear and true. It was the ordinary youths with extraordinary minds who saved the world. Final Fantasy II is an underappreciated masterpiece. It touches on many relatable topics: how to move on after experiencing traumatic events, seeing a loved one go down a difficult path, learning to forgive yourself, and much more. Many people will tell you to avoid this game because it is a very strong flavor, but I exhort you to play it. It's Final Fantasy, man, and you could be missing out on what could be your favorite in the series. So as you can see, Final Fantasy II does not feel like Final Fantasy I. But that's the point. It's not supposed to. That is what makes Final Fantasy stand out as a series. The feelings and emotions each game brings. I wish that this game would have come out in America back then, but I'm glad I finally appreciate its legacy as much as I do now. It is arguably the most important Final Fantasy game, and I love it.